If anybody feels the need to kind of stand up and stretch, I know we're in that kind of, we just ate lunch, we've been sitting down, so I certainly understand. I want to just give that, just say that's okay if you need to. I'm just so delighted to be here. I want to thank Richard Bennett for the invitation. I am a native of Northwest Iowa, so I'm always really excited when I get invitations to come to Western Iowa, and so I'm particularly excited to be here today. And I just have really enjoyed being at the conference the entire weekend. It's just been really interesting and generative, and I have a lot of thoughts that I can't wait to keep talking to so many of you about. So I just wanted to say thank you to begin with for being so welcoming and for putting on this really great conference. It's been wonderful, and I'm so glad to be here. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit today is how we have written in Iowa history, what is Iowa history, but using this particular journal that I happen to be the editor for to talk a little bit about that. And that journal is the Annals of Iowa. What is the Annals? Jeff talked a little bit or mentioned a little bit, but what the Annals is it is the oldest and the only academic history journal published in the state of Iowa, by the state of Iowa. It was founded in 1863, so right in the middle of the Civil War. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about why I think that's important for shaping what the Annals did for quite a long time. It did something very different than what it does now. But what the journal does now is we publish between 8 and 10 academic articles. These are academic history articles. So they have a little bit different flavor than some maybe local history articles or what you might find in a museum, but very much of a kind. These I think of very much in the same ecosystem, even though they're in a slightly different register, if you will. And so we publish 8 to 10 of those, along with between 80 to 100 book reviews every year. So that is what I spend my days doing, is deeply immersed in Iowa history and trying to think about and engage with new topics. That's what the Annals does today, and I want to talk a little bit later about what I hope that it can continue to do moving forward. But I also wanted to begin by looking at what the Annals did in the past. What was the Annals and where did it go, and how has it developed over time? And I just want to mention, too, as I'm getting started, how, especially at a conference like the one we're at together, celebrating the 175th anniversary of the Mormon trek across the state of Iowa, of Kanesville, of the statehood of Iowa, is that one of the groups that is talked about with more frequency than other religious groups is the Mormons in the Annals of Iowa. I was just looking, and about once a decade there's an article about, an actual article about Mormons in Iowa, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's far more than you'll find an article about Methodists or Presbyterians. And we often are reviewing 1 or 2 books a year about the Mormon experience in Iowa. I know that several folks here have reviewed books for us in the past. And so if you are doing research, I should say, take a look at the Annals. There's often something in there for your interests. And if you ever have questions, send me an email. I'll be happy to help you find those kinds of things. But the Annals, what was it? Where did it come from, and how has it changed? And what can that tell us a little bit about how Iowa history has been written over the last 158 years, right? So the Annals of Iowa comes about in 1863, and it carries with it on its very first page this mission, and I'm going to read it to you, the mission that was set forward in the legislation that developed the State Historical Society of Iowa in 1857. So this is what its charge was, and it was to, quote, to rescue from oblivion the memory of its early pioneers, to obtain and preserve varieties of their exploits, perils, and hardy adventures, to secure facts and statements relative to the history, genius, and progress or decay of our Indian tribes, to exhibit faithfully the antiquities, past and present resources of Iowa, also to aid in the publication of such collections of the society as the society shall from time to time deem of value or interest, right? So, and that's the end of the quote. But that is what the Annals was meant to do. It was supposed to bring together and collect these reminiscences, these stories, these ideas, and to share the collections of the State Historical Society of Iowa. And for the first several decades, I would argue actually for the first century of the journal's existence, that is what it did, right? So what I described to you now, this kind of strong, interpretive, analytical approach to history, that's not what it was charged with, and that's not where it came from in this kind of earlier period. And so as Dr. Bremer mentioned earlier, the Annals was full of diary entries. So you might find a pioneer whose diary is published, or obituaries, these kinds of things. This is what was published. And a lot of times it was published by people who were leading the society. There's some great articles about the history of Iowa history, which is a little bit meta, if you will. When it's like someone like me really enjoys that, right? Reading the history of how the history was done. But they talk about this early period as the gentleman historians or the pioneer historians. These were the well-educated men, many of them coming from the East, often New England, who came and wrote histories and often carried on those reminiscences. The Annals was founded in Iowa City. So if you know today, the Annals is located in Des Moines. And they were actually published in Iowa City from 1863 until the Annals foundered in 1874, and then ended up with a brief hiatus, coming back in 1882, eventually closing down again in 1884 before it's finally kickstarted, this time in Des Moines in 1893, and we've been going strong since then. So there were a few moments there. I love this, and I'll read this to you too. There's this great quote from the second editor, who notices that the Annals had stopped being published for 9 years, and he writes this to his readers. He says, this number of the Annals is tardily issued. I just thought that was I thought it was a very modest way, right? Or kind of underselling what happened. 9 years, tardily issued. So if you're ever late for something, even up to 9 years, maybe you could use the same kind of quote. But he writes that on the very first page of that 1874 issue. What I want to mention, too, is that the Annals is coming out of a moment when the U.S. is in the middle of the Civil War, right? So this is 1863. The journal would have been kind of churning the content in the years beforehand, right? But this is happening in the middle of the Civil War. I find that really striking, right? That you are in the middle of a war, and all of a sudden you decide to start publishing a historical publication. But that, I think, is also really important to understanding where this journal came from. It came from this moment when people were looking around and realizing soldiers were leaving, and they were also acutely aware that they were living through something extremely historic. And so they said to themselves, we need to publish this. And they say that much in the actual articles. And this is a quote, again, from the very first issue, where they talk about how, quote, the times indeed are not propitious, as a nation is involved in the most unhappy civil war, and likes of which for extent and atrocity the world has never saw. It is therefore most fit that some pages of current events, illustrative of the character of people so brave and patriotic, should be recorded for the benefit of future generations. In troublous times, these annals of the society are begun. This humble publication is begun relating to the state already illustrious in arms, but destined it is confidently hoped to be still more illustrious when arms shall yield to peace and prosperity throughout the whole land. So that's the end of, and the quotation there. But these are the beginning words of the Annals of Iowa, right? It tells you something about those who are writing. And these are men, of course, who didn't go to fight, but they're watching their sons and maybe brothers go to war and realizing how drastic this experience is. So I bring that up because I think it's helpful for us to understand that where the Annals is coming from, where this journal is coming from, is trying to collect history, to write history, to preserve history, these kinds of things, to publish journal articles that are obituaries, reminiscences, diaries, this kind of thing, right? So if we're trying to understand, okay, how has Iowa history been written? In these earlier years, it was capturing these moments, these memories, these reminiscences, making sure that we document what's happening. It's very different than what's being done now, but it never said it was what's being done now. Some of the books that were written, these kinds of things, that's a slightly different story. But this journal was doing something different, capturing the story in the real time, because these folks looked around and said, we're living through history and we need to capture this, right? Eventually, other journals would come along that would begin to fill other kind of areas, if you will. Professor Bremer mentioned the Iowa Journal of History and Politics. This is published in Iowa City, and the Iowa Journal of History and Politics, eventually just the Iowa Journal of History, is a much more academic journal that's published, and it kind of goes hand in hand. It's doing something that the Annals isn't, but it's existing within this history ecosystem. And that particular journal is published from 1903 until 1961. The editor, she passes away in 1961, and the journal is closed with her death. They don't ever replace her, so the journal is finished. And another important journal that comes up is the Palimpsest, which eventually becomes Iowa Heritage Illustrated. But the Palimpsest is a popular history journal, right? So this is going to be a journal that's aimed at shorter articles, things that are easier to digest. You don't have to have as much background knowledge in order to consume them, right? So you have, these are I would say the three main journals. There are others that exist alongside them. Eventually a children's publication comes along called The Goldfinch, but that's in the 70s. But what happens is, for most of the 20th century, you have this Iowa history network that, of course, there are books being published by university presses, by popular presses, but by the State Historical Society, broadly understood, you have these kind of three different angles. You have the popular history in the Palimpsest, you have the capturing the moments, recollections, these kinds of published primary sources, things happening with the Annals, and the academic history journal in the Iowa Journal of History and Politics. Does that make some sense? So as we're thinking about how the Iowa history has developed, I think it's useful to think about the Annals, because the Annals hasn't always been what it is now, and some of how it's changed has to do with how it exists in a much broader world of people writing and thinking about Iowa history. This all begins to change, this kind of dynamic that's at play with these three different stools, if you will, that are published by the state in the 1960s when Mildred Throne passes away. And the Iowa Journal of History is closed in order to focus on the Palimpsest. And it's in this period that academic historians, those who are writing academic histories, don't have a place to go with their content. A few things come out in the Annals, but the Annals, again, is doing its own thing. And that really begins to change in 1972 with a new editor of the Annals. Her name is Judith Gilder. And as an aside, one of the things that's most interesting to me about who's driving a lot of Iowa history, especially in the journals, is how big a role women have played in Iowa history. It's something that isn't discussed in the publication of Iowa history as often, but the Iowa Journal of History and Politics was which was the academic journal. The editor was at first Ruth Gallagher, who was a woman who earned her PhD at the University of Iowa all through the 40s, and then in the 50s, Mildred Throne takes over. And then the Annals begins its academic turn under Judith Gilder. And so it's notable that in an era when there weren't many women earning PhDs and serving as professors, you have these women who are really driving this academic push in Iowa history. So Judith Gilder takes over in 1972 in Des Moines and realizes that when the Iowa Journal of History closed, there wasn't that avenue, and she begins to change the format of the Annals to look more like an academic journal. One or two, maybe three academic articles, and she introduces book reviews. So if you go back to 1972, you can see that it starts to look similar to what it does now. And what's really fun, I think, is all of our issues are online. So if you want to actually go back, you can. You can go look up an issue from 1973 and see how it's changed from, say, 1968. I have some interns working on a metadata creation project for me, and they were working back through the 70s, and they're like, things have really starting to change back in the 60s. I'm like, yeah, they have. Let me tell you a story. But you can really see that, and you could do that. You could do that yourselves. It's all online. Just type in Annals of Iowa, and you can do all that exploring. But Judith Gilder begins this process, and she is editor for 8 years, which is then taken over by her successor, Daly. Who then does even more of this. Judith Gilder introduces gender in particular. There's a lot more study of gender and women's experiences happening in the 70s, as Professor Bremer mentioned, with, say, Glenda Riley's work. This is happening at the time. Daly even broadens things further, bringing in more topics, especially around race in the 80s. And then in 1987, my predecessor took over the Annals and became the longest-serving editor of the Annals, Marvin Bergman. And Marv, I'll call him Marv because he's my friend and I talk to him often, but Marv also played a critical role in helping to develop the Annals into the kind of premier academic journal that it is today. And in a lot of ways, I can come and talk to you and share this history as someone who benefits from the work that Marv did. I recognize that so much of what the Annals is today is because of the predecessors who've gone before. But the journal has shifted yet again, and the journal is now, as I mentioned, it's the last journal standing, if you will, of the ones that had existed. The palimpsest became Iowa Heritage Illustrated, and that closed up in 2014. The Goldfinch, which was a children's publication, ended in about the year 2000, and as I mentioned, the Iowa Journal of History was closed in 1961. So of all of these kind of journals that existed in the ecosystem of Iowa history, the Annals is the one that's left. And the Annals is the one that has shifted the most in its identity, going from kind of a collection of miscellaneous information, current events, topics in Iowa history, to what it is now as a scholarly journal. And I think that's helpful, too, to see that Iowa history has changed and how it's been written has changed. And there are also different players in the game today. One of the things we don't do much in the journal anymore is publish primary sources. And can you think of a reason why? It has everything to do with the internet. So many primary sources are now available on the internet. We don't publish newspaper articles from the past, largely because you can find many of them digitized today. So there's a different environment in which Iowa history is happening today, and the Annals serves an important role in that, but it's doing so in a way that's dynamic, that recognizes the different space. And even the Annals has moved itself into an online format. I mentioned that you can find all of our articles online, and we have a healthy and committed subscriber base, but each year we receive at least, last year, I'll say, in 2020, while we have several hundred subscribers to our journal, we had over 400,000 downloads of our content online from all over the world. I think it was over 200 countries last year, with the United States leading the way, but China, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Canada close behind, or not close behind, but following along, right? So we are reaching a different audience in different ways because of the ways that that writing has changed into a digital space. We still have our print copies that you can subscribe to or purchase, but we also are recognizing that people want to consume our content in a different way. So Iowa history looks very different. How we've written it has changed and been dynamic, and the Annals helps us to see some of that. I say all this to show how an ecosystem of writing has taken place, but I also want to spend just a few minutes today, my last few minutes, on what's next for Iowa history, right? So if this is how Iowa history has been written, and Professor Bremer gave us a good idea of what's been talked about, what isn't there, what's next? And I think there's a lot of opportunity. I'm really interested and grateful for this conference, because one of the areas of Iowa history that isn't explored very much is Southwest Iowa, to be frank. Southwest Iowa has a lot of potential. I've been hearing these great stories about Kanesville and Council Bluffs, about the Mormon winter quarters, and about how important this space is. And these are stories that are largely omitted. I have a map that sits next to my desk right here, and I map out where the articles are, where in the Iowa counties we discuss, right? And I'm from Northwest Iowa, I mentioned. And if you go to Northwest Iowa, we always complain that everyone ignores us. But if you look at my map, that's not true. Northwest Iowa has had a few articles in the Annals, and there have been plenty of articles in Eastern Iowa, but it's Southwest Iowa, where we need to spend more time. We need to focus a bit more on that history. And there are some ideas I have about how we can do that and what that looks like, and part of that is coming to conferences like this, being present. But it's an area where we need more research, is in Southwest Iowa, on the history of Council Bluffs. I was recently talking to a wonderful scholar of pre-statehood Iowa, and he was talking about how places like Dubuque have these wonderful histories, but places like Council Bluffs need more, at least in his time period, right? And so that's an area that I hope Iowa history can move forward. Professor Bremer has mentioned that recent Iowa history is dominated by journalists, but it's time for historians to start doing some of that work. It's a little strange to say sometimes that we should be studying the history that many of us have lived through, but it's time to bring our tools as historians to bear on at least the 1990s and early 2000s, these kind of farm crisis moments. It's important. And then there's a variety of other, I think religious history is an area of tremendous potential in Iowa history. I joke about this with Marv, my predecessor, because he is a trained religious historian. That's his area of expertise. I am a trained religious historian. That's my area of expertise. And Iowa's religious history is one of the areas that has been least directly explored in the past. And so that includes the history of the Latter-day Saints, but it also includes a variety of other religious communities that are here in Iowa, because Iowa is a really diverse religiously diverse state, but oftentimes those stories are not told. There are very few studies outside of small journals of, say, Methodists or Presbyterians. You can find them, but they haven't been published very often in these broader context. So that is also an area of opportunity. So when I think about the future of Iowa history, I hope it is one that takes more seriously and grapples more seriously with the ideas of religion. It's one that takes more seriously the geographic diversity of the state. We've done a pretty good job in some areas, but here in Southwest Iowa, there's a lot of opportunity. And if you have ideas, come find me. We can talk about it. I think there's a lot of potential. And I'm looking forward to it. I think there's great work to be done. Iowa history is dynamic, and it's alive, and it's happening in a variety of places. And I should mention that what I do is academic, scholarly kind of history articles, but it exists in that broader ecosystem. Other places where history is happening is in your local museums, in the historic preservation efforts here locally and at the state, right? I work alongside colleagues who are in museums, in state historic preservation, the State Historic Preservation Office, and those who are in archives and libraries, right? So this is just one part of how Iowa history is written. It's my perspective, but I recognize it's a part of this really dynamic collection of really serious historians who are writing and doing work locally, at the state level, and even broader. So those are just some of my hopefully thoughtful or engaging thoughts on how this journal has changed and adapted within a broad Iowa history ecosystem, and where I think there's potential for exploring new topics and finding new partners in the future. Thank you so much for your time. It's really a delight to have been here with you. It's my privilege. Thank you.
I don't know if you got the memo when you came into the room, but each of you were supposed to come up with 3 questions each for our presenters. So what questions do you have for them? Jeff, are you there with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Fantastic. Any questions from the audience online, or could you read that one for us, the online one? I can't see it from here, sorry.
Since the Iowa Freedom Trail project began, how can Iowa's history of the Underground Railroad been expanding and published? How has Iowa's history of the Underground Railroad been expanding and published, particularly in Southwest Iowa?
I can try to give that a little bit of an answer. Someone who was involved in that project 10 years ago or so, Lowell Soike, has published 2 books. One called Busy in the Cause, Iowa and the Free Soil Movement. I'm paraphrasing the title. And that is a story of Iowa slavery, Kansas, Nebraska, mostly 1850s. And then he also has another book called Necessary Courage, which is about Iowa and the Underground Railroad. The topics cover some of the same territory. The better of the 2 that looks at the Iowa history and the struggle overall is Busy in the Cause. If you're looking for Underground Railroad, look at Necessary Courage. That's probably the two go-to books for the topic, both of which I am using in the book I'm currently writing on Iowa. Um, and Andrew might have additional comments there.
Yeah, I would just mention that those are the go-to books, and Lola's still around. Not as easily contacted these days, but I just saw him at a reception recently. But I would also mention that we continue to do that work at the State Historical Society. We have volunteers who are processing and continuing some of these projects, not as quickly as we once did, but because of some delays resulting from COVID. But this work still continues, and I know there are several other younger scholars continuing this work. I have been working with a few. I won't name them because their projects are still very much working at this point, but I know there are several scholars who are doing this work, and I hope will continue to do so in a way that will be published in the future. So there's both Lowell's work, but hopefully some in the pipeline that I know it's on the way.
That was a great question from our online audience. Thank you very much. Any other questions, please?
I have a question. I missed the title of the book that was about Buxton, Iowa.
Missed the title of the book that was about Buxton, Iowa.
The best book on Buxton is by Dorothy Schweter, her husband Elmer Schweter. It's in two different editions, but Buxton: Work and Racial Equality in a Coal Mining Community by Dorothy Schweter and two other authors. That is the best go-to book.
Thank you.
No problem.
I was just going to mention, if you are looking for, there's some at the State Historical Society, our YouTube channel will have a lecture, at least one lecture on Buxton as well. So if you, I forget, there's one that's available and there's one that's not, so I don't remember which one is which. But if you check out our YouTube channel, you may be able to find, an hour-long kind of intro.
Please, go ahead.
Yes, I'm also really interested in Buxton and what you have to say about it. And this might not be a fair question because I know you were summarizing the work of many other historians, along the way. But I was just wondering if you happen to know kind of about the relationship between Buxton and some of the other southeastern coal mining towns like Hines and Avery and Beacon, Albia, and that were maybe more traditional and did have company stores, and if there was any sort of animosity between the different companies or the different communities, and if there was much of an African American presence in some of these other towns that I believe were heavily Scandinavian in makeup, for example.
Let me try and whittle that down for the online audience. Another question about Buxton, the relationship between Buxton and other coal towns in southeastern Iowa, including conflicts between Buxton and those particular areas,
And
their companies, and you also mentioned African Americans in there as well. So, any thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Andrew.
I haven't done research itself on Buxton, but what I can say is that I know that there was no reciprocity extended, right? So if you were living in integrated Buxton as a black person and went to Albia, you would experience segregation. You would not be allowed a great deal of prejudice, right? So there was absolutely no reciprocity, and I think people were very aware of that. There's a lot of discussion of black residents once Buxton ceases to exist in the 1920s, moving to other places in Iowa and not having anywhere near the same experience. I'm not sure about the rivalry or how that was experienced, but there was absolutely no reciprocity, and I think people were well aware of that. And even within Buxton, there was a bit of segregation that took place. I think the way that the authors mention it as it was in private life or self-selected, right? But the Swedes, for example, settled in their own little areas because they didn't want to integrate with others. And so even within Buxton, there was kind of self-selection, even if it wasn't enforced or mandatory. But that was with the Swedes in particular, that had racial but also ethnic identity elements in Buxton. So that's about as much as I feel comfortable saying without doing a little bit more work. But there was no reciprocity at all, and there was none experienced once Buxton ceased to exist. I don't know if, Jeff, you have any more, but.
I can tell you that the baseball team of Albia would not play Buxton's integrated baseball team, for example. That gives you some idea of social tensions.
Thank you. Another excellent question. Any other questions from our audience?
There was a question to the panelists. Can we get a listing of the documents discussed? He wasn't able to jot them all down while they were talking.
Is there a way that, Jeff, all the documents that you listed, the different books, could be put online somewhere? Or could they contact you if they want that list because they just couldn't write all that down?
Yeah, you can contact me. You might find my email and on my Iowa State University faculty page. I'll be glad to send you this article if you want it, or any material that you might need.
Thank you. That's very gracious of you to offer. I have a quick question, if I could, for our two discussants here. Jeff, I appreciated the fact that you were talking a little bit about the evolution of how the history of Iowa was written, in particular, the theme of subaltern voices and looking at women, for example, looking at groups of different racial makeups. And also, Angie, you were kind of talking about the evolution of the journal and that sort of thing. I was wondering, and for both of you, when you talk about the history, the evolution of how the history of Iowa has been written, how has this, have you seen any, for example, broader historical trends, for example, migrant movements across the United States and in Iowa, or have there been different trends in historical methodology or certain fads or terms that have kind of changed the way in which the history has been written or the themes that have been focused on when people are writing about the history of Iowa?
You could go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I would say definitely. You see, for example, I mentioned that when Judy Gilder took over the Annals, you saw more focus on women's history. And that wasn't just because Judy was a woman, because the previous editors of the academic journal had been women. It had everything to do with where academic historians, were turning and asking questions about, well, what was women's experience like? The integration of more questions about race under Christy Daly in the 1980s, that had a lot to do with where scholars were turning their attention, right? So I think a lot of that has to do with the topics that are discussed in the Annals. A lot of those who are writing in Iowa history are very much engaged in broader conversations. I was just talking to Jeff earlier this week. No one makes a living as an Iowa historian only. They do other things, and so a lot of these folks are integrated in the academic conversations that are taking place. I think that's also why it's been harder to do state history because many places have turned away from state history, focusing on broader national, global, international connections. Unless you're in Texas, which is where I moved before, and they still love state history there, a lot of people want to ask bigger questions, and there's been a move away from state and local history that's been a challenge, but one that we continue to try to meet. So I think that's also very much at play in the work we do. So that's very briefly my thoughts.
That is a great summary. In terms of methodology, Dorothy Schweter, whose presence for Iowa history is vast. Her work is everywhere. Buxton, the Amish, you name it. But she, in the 1970s, began to do lots of oral history with Buxton residents, people from coal miners, from the Amish, and her dissertation, I think, was on Buxton. But that interest in common people and sitting down and getting their stories And using that information to broaden the story of Iowa was important, and it is part of all of her work. So the oral history component there, and the history of those who've been left out, as Andrew said, become increasingly important.
As Jeff's talking, I think it also reminds me, in Jeff's talk, he talks about, he mentioned how people aren't, flocking to Iowa to study because they think of Iowa as a certain way. And I think that also reflects one of the challenges we face that affects the way we do history. Is if people think that only white mainline middle-class Protestants, lived in Iowa, then people say, well, we want to study other things, so they look elsewhere. But actually, there's a great deal of religious diversity and class diversity and racial diversity. There's all these other stories to be told, but we have to, is that point making some sense, right? This idea that as the profession looks at other stories, they don't look to Iowa, when in reality, Iowa has all these stories. People just have to come and look. So I think that dynamic's also at play.
I'm also wondering, Jeff, if you found anything in terms of the way that rural versus urban history has been written in Iowa.
Yes, Iowa is historically seen as an agricultural state. Iowa is historically seen, even in the popular imagination today, as a place of farmers, although only 5% of Iowans actually qualify as farm producers. Iowa's urban history has been overlooked. And if you happen to be part of a group that lives in urban areas, African Americans, for example, your history is often overlooked because there's not much focus upon the history of cities. There is no good book that's a history of Des Moines. There is no good history of Des Moines that is more than 50 years or 60 years or isn't by a local historian. Many of Iowa's cities haven't got much attention at all. Council Bluffs, there's been plenty of work done on Sioux City, and Davenport with Sharon Wood. But we could use all sorts of urban studies and town studies and of all the various groups that live there in Iowa. And I'll let Andrew follow up.
I would just mention too on this rural-urban question, in our fall issue of the Annals, we have a special 175th anniversary of the Annals fall issue. It's got some art. It's going to be a great issue. So let me know if you're interested in it. But one of the authors, Pam Riney-Kerberg, makes the point that really the only place that Iowa stands in the national narrative, so where people think of a national event through Iowa's lens, is the farm crisis. And this is Pam's point, not mine. But she points out that, and that's something that's very rural, right? So the only time that people think of something through Iowa's lens to understand a national event is when it was just, unapologetically, undeniably a rural kind of crisis, and that's the farm crisis. So Pam talks about that a little more in her article, but I think that's telling, right? That the only moment when Iowa is allowed to speak to a national event, or it does, not allowed to, but it happens to, is when it's something that is so clearly a rural crisis, even though that also had urban dynamics as well. Yeah, so. Yeah, I don't want to sing it again.
This will be our last question.
First of all, thank you both for participating today in the conference. On religious history, I can't help but think of the experience we've had. When we go to Locust Creek, Iowa, near Corydon, from a Latter-day Saint perspective here now, we go there to see where the great hymn, Come, Come, Ye Saints, was written, which is the anthem of the Mormonites, right here in Iowa. And
question for our online audience is, why is there not more written on the religious history of Iowa?
I would love to comment on that. Yeah, so I, I have a couple of thoughts, and it's something I've thought a lot about as well. I grew up in Northwest Iowa, right next to all the Dutch Calvinists, so you have the Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church of America in Sioux County, but then you move south of county and there are all these German Catholics, right, and British descended Episcopalians, and there's so much religious diversity, but you don't see it. And so I think there are two things at play, and I think there are two kind of, you see a move away from religion in a lot of academic historians. A lot of academic historians don't tackle religion directly, and there's a few articles about that. The one I most recently read is an older article by John Butler, who is an American religious historian called Jack in the Box Faith, but talks about how historians in the U.S. don't really know what to do with religion, so they don't look at religion. And so within the broader field of history, U.S. history, you don't see as much religion. I remember going through graduate work, doctoral work, and you'd ask a question about religion, and so many of my colleagues didn't know what to do. They just didn't have the vocabulary to discuss or know how to handle not only people of faith, but people of faith in the past. So you have that element, that's one, but then you also have a really robust and dynamic guild of American religious historians, but they also aren't talking about places like Iowa. They are talking about concerns about, they're looking at a lot of the themes that we've discussed, race, internationalism, class, and they aren't looking to Iowa to tell those stories. And so you have these two groups that for different reasons are overlooking this really important part of Iowa history. So even you look at someone like, I'm trying to think of some folks who've done great work on Iowa history are often not dealing with religion, even if they are looking at Iowa, because they don't have that religious lens. And then you have the religious historians who are doing great work on religion, but aren't looking at Iowa. They want to talk about places otherwise. And I think that's also, except with the exception of Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday is the one place where Iowa is really discussed religiously, which is also surprising because there are other major figures from religious figures that have roots in Iowa, but it's Billy Sunday who gets attention. I could talk a lot more about that, and just let me know. But those are I think there are two kind of streams that are both overlooking Iowa for different reasons, but with the same effect that people just keep overlooking, and I hope to change that. But
as a geographer, I might wonder if it's because of the lack of visible material culture when it comes to religion as well. You drive through Iowa, you don't see religion like you would if you're driving through Europe. So maybe it's just one of those things that you just don't see it, and so you don't think about it. You see farms, but you don't see religion necessarily there. We are out of time. I'd like to thank Jeff and thank Andrew for their very stimulating and thought-provoking presentations. Those of you in the audience, please join me in thanking them again.